also see Canadians tightening their belts as they look down the barrel of a recession, and we're seeing less donations flow into this space. So a lot more with a lot.
At some point, the opportunities to actually have that conversation continues to open as more and more people start to question whether a private sector or a public only sector approach is going to work, where you need all three to make it happen.
You're listening to Let's Imagine, an Imagine Canada podcast for everyone interested in social issues and the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Bruce McDonald. At Imagine Canada, we believe that by leveraging our national vantage point, building cross-sector relationships, and sharing and developing our knowledge base, we can advance social, economic, and environmental justice through our collective action. Join us as we dive deep into conversations that have big implications for the nonprofit and charitable sector here in Canada. A special thank you to our knowledge partner, Carter's Professional Corporation, and our supporting partner, Sage Canada. Together, let's imagine a stronger future. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special Budget 2023 edition of Let's Imagine. On March 28th, the federal government released its latest financial blueprint, and we're delighted to be joined by two members of Imagine Canada's Public Policy Committee to talk about the implications from Budget 2023. I'd like to welcome Jordan Gray, a public policy specialist and Imagine Canada board member, and David Coletto, Chair and CEO of Abacus Data. Gentlemen, let's get right to it. David, let's start with you. How would you describe this budget as it relates to everyday Canadians and the broader economy?
Well, good to see you, Bruce and Jordan. Thanks for having me on. I mean, I think when you look at public opinion right now, I think if you're the government trying to respond to it, a few things stand out. The first is there's no doubt that the cost of living is essential to most people's thinking right now, by far the top issue over the last number of years, actually. It's really cemented, though, and people are feeling the pressure both from rising housing costs, food costs, energy costs, interest rate increases, you name it. They're feeling that pressure. At the same time, for most people, the healthcare system's in a crisis, and so they feel there's a real problem there, and look to all levels of government as being both the problem and perhaps the solution to moving forward. On the broader economic outlook, though, I'm seeing I think some cautious optimism, right? Like people understand that we are still likely headed to some choppy economic waters, but 1 out of 5 Canadians actually think the economy over the next 12 months is going to get better as opposed to get worse. So whether that's wishful thinking or their sense of how they're feeling relative to everything, I think that's unclear. But I think this budget, in my mind, is a response to a number of crises that have affected the globe and forced a response by the government. Certainly the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, Joe Biden's and the U.S. government's kind of aggressive investment into clean technology, clean energy has forced the government to respond. But I also think out of sheer politics, this is also a budget that's meant to help the government survive, to get through another year. And that means getting one of the opposition parties to support it, which the New Democrats have because of the investments that they made in both dental care and the so-called grocery rebate, basically, doubling the GST rebate to help pay for the rising cost of many things. So I think it's a very much a transactional budget in some instances, and from the public's perspective, one that, although perhaps not communicated as clearly or effectively as the government would have liked, will at least appear to people to be in response to the things they're worried about.
That's great. Thank you. So, Jordan, over to you. I mean, Imagine Canada has characterized this budget as a missed opportunity for structural change. From your perspective, what does this mean?
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing from this budget is a lot of or some program investments that doesn't really differentiate from past government spending or how government has previously issued their support to the sector. I mean, if it was going to be different, we would have seen carve-outs for specific data collection in the sector, core funding in the sector, a home in government, which the sector has been very clear about, which Imagine's own budget submission spoke about. And so we didn't get that this time around. And it's important to speak about the home in government as a large structural change. It's not simply a program element. Because if there was a permanent home within the government machinery, that would help to facilitate a reliable stream of funding for the sector on a regular basis. And this would be the case of how government funds other areas, just like how it is funding women's programming and women's organizations, because it is part of the business of government. There is a Department for Status of Women, and so it is always and routinely going to be funding for women and gender diverse organizations will routinely be part of government's agenda because of this. And at the same time, without having a designated space to say these are the needs of the sector overall, and to communicate a clear onboarding into the budget for budget dollars for specific funding for the sector, charities and nonprofits are routinely having to decide between, are they going to pursue program dollars or are they going to pursue core funding? And oftentimes they cannot get both. And it's at the detriment to one or the other.
Absolutely. And certainly some of the policy files that you mentioned are ones that sector leaders have been working on for a very long time. And given the fact that they weren't evident or present in this budget, will be ones that we will continue to work on in the future. So David, the charitable and nonprofit sector has been on a quest for many years to have its economic contribution, things like 2.6 million workers, representing 8.3% of GDP, almost 13 million volunteers annually, acknowledged as a key part of the overall economy. This budget demonstrates that this quest has yet to come to an end. Measures such as changes to credit card fees targeted at small businesses could have included charities and nonprofits. What are your thoughts on how this sector can ensure a greater understanding of its economic contribution?
Well, I think my answer starts with, the normal conception of economy is jobs, economic output, trade, right? Those kinds of things. But I think the first step is, and I think you and Imagine Canada often try to do this, but I think we need to do it more aggressively, is expand the meaning of economy, right? When we talk about the economy from the public's perspective, they think being able to get health services that I need is part of the economy, right? Being able to feel safe walking down the street or going to my downtown in my city or community is part of the economy. And so being able to start better connecting the dots for people between the things that they're worried about, the things they want to see improved, and the work that the sector's doing, I think is job number one, right? So, for example, you talk about the cost of living, we talk about the crisis in healthcare, we talk about, I think, a sense in many communities across the country that public disorder is on the rise, right? What role does charitable and nonprofit sector play? A significant role in helping to solve, or at least mitigate or prevent, more importantly, all those things from happening, or at least dealing with the effects of those, right? For those in international development, global migration and crises in other parts of the world are having a direct effect on Canada. I mean, we just had the US president come to Ottawa, and one of the major agreements was dealing with the flow of people from the United States, refugees to Canada, and how to properly, in their minds, deal with that. So I do think that there is an opportunity to provide, and I love this term, constant gentle pressure on policymakers, on elected officials, on anyone who has influence in the conversation to remember that the economy doesn't just include, private sector businesses, right? And that there is a decline in the confidence of government to deliver services, right? That suggests to me there is a obvious and growing role for the nonprofit sector to play. And for whatever reason, this government in particular, I think, doesn't see the opportunity that exists there, right? So when we talk about concerns about substance abuse disorder or mental health, impacting people's perception about the safety and livability of their communities, talking about, what the sector is doing in those areas is important. The labor shortages that we're seeing right across the country, we often only talk about the labor shortages or the difficulty that those who, operate truck transport companies or, manufacturing or skilled trades. But the shortage overall also affects the ability of your members, Bruce, to get and retain people to support and do the work that they do. And so expanding that, and I think not just talking about the GDP effect, but that broader effect and the role that the sector can be as a partner, I think helps get the public to understand it better and to see you not just as a third sector, but in fact a core part of an integrated system that's working to solve these problems.
And it's a great point. I've always actually struggled with the whole third sector concept because it sort of relegates our sector to junior partner status as opposed to being an integral part of vibrant communities. I think many Canadians would certainly miss the sector if it wasn't there. Jordan, while there was an overall lack of budget announcements that addressed long-standing sector recommendations, there were some announcements that will impact charities and nonprofits. Items such as building the capacity of organizations serving Black communities and the disability community, the renewal of funding for the Regional Economic Growth through Innovation Program, funding for women's organizations, reproductive health organizations, arts organizations, and minority language organizations, investments in food security infrastructure, and improvements to increase accessibility of procurement opportunities. From your perspective, do these add up to a reasonable investment in sector organizations as they seek to address complex social problems?
I don't want to downplay the government's investments in these areas, because these are important and necessary investments, and in areas where organizations have been asking for funding for a significant period of time. But again, these are investments in specific subsections of the charitable and non-for-profit space. And because the government has made decisions to fund certain areas, they've also made decisions not to fund other areas of the non-for-profit and charitable sector. Now, I want to pause to specifically speak about the investments being made around for Black communities and Black serving organizations. This budget is building on the government's already investment of a $200 million endowment that is now going to be administered by the Foundation for Black Communities. And it's an additional $25 million starting 24-25 for Black serving organizations. And it is, if anything, it's still not enough, because Bruce, I don't know if you know the number, but there was a report on this that the Foundation for Black Communities worked with Carleton University on to develop, and for every $100, you know how much of that goes to Black communities? I think you probably know the figure, or Dave might know the figure, but I was shocked that it's 7 cents. For every $100 donated to large charities, 7 cents of that goes to Black serving organizations. So, if these might seem like large investment, but it certainly is critical investments. At the same time, charities are having to do a lot more with a lot less. They just like businesses, just like regular everyday Canadians, charities are grappling with the rising costs, and those rising costs are making it harder to operate programs, and their core operating expenses are also increasing. But they don't have access to core funding dollars. And unlike the private sector, they can't pass off these increasing expenses onto a client base, nor would they be willing to do it. So even in this time, with inflation and rising expenses, the income that charities and nonprofits would have relied on through donations and through government investments is also we see diminishing, and we also see Canadians tightening their belts as they look down the barrel of a recession, and we're seeing less donations flow into this space. So a lot more with a lot less.
And I think to that point, one of the other things to add in is the increasing demand for services. So not just dealing with rising costs and lower revenues, but understanding that people and communities are coming to organizations in record numbers.
Absolutely. And we're seeing that especially on frontline delivery services, charities and nonprofits. Food banks are facing unprecedented levels of demand. And the government itself has acknowledged how food inflation is affecting Canadians, and we're seeing this in shelters for underhoused and unsheltered. So these frontline services that are doing critical work for the most vulnerable Canadians, when Canadians need the support the most, are not getting the resources to provide to meet this level of demand.
Absolutely. David, to a certain extent, Budget 2023 has a feeling of deja vu, meaning that it feels like we've seen this before. Governments dabbling in support for social purpose organizations while not really making this sector a meaningful priority. In your work in understanding Canadians, do you think there's public support for stronger measures that would protect and guarantee that services are available in their communities?
I absolutely think so. And I think it's driven by a few things. I mean, the conversation around general service delivery, whether it's delivered by a public sector organization or not-for-profit charitable, has really focused over the last number of months and even year on, I think, those users of those services feeling that they're under-delivering, right? Even in this budget, there was an entire chapter about effective government, right? Investments in airports because people don't like waiting, the chaos of the airports during, the holiday season, or, getting government right again, right? There's despite the fact that government has grown, public sector, by, I think, like 28% over the life of this government, there is a sense among the public that its inability to deliver at times is quite unsatisfying. And so when we talk about, the public's not just support, but I think enthusiasm to see those organizations in their community, that I would suspect, and I haven't done deep research on this, but I suspect based on what I know and what I've seen is that they would at times think that those organizations are actually more effective at solving and preventing and dealing with the issues that they are seeing actually get worse and worse over time. And so as Jordan said, right, there's this, and I'll add to it, almost this perfect storm brewing where, yes, as a result of the financial pressure that Canadian households are facing, you're seeing less donations going in to the sector at the same time that demand's going up. And you've got a tight labor market, which means for many of your members, you're going to need to pay more in order to attract the kinds of people that you want. So it's just creating this really difficult environment. So I do think there would be broad political support, actually from across the political spectrum, in fact, for a government strategy, and I say an economic strategy that included the nonprofit and charitable sector as part of the package of, how do I even say this, as part of the strategy to deliver the services that people are looking for. And I just don't, I'm sure like you, Bruce, like knocking your head on your desk, I don't know why they don't see that opportunity. I really, and I don't think it's because of any lack of evidence that exists that it's there. And so we'll see. I think at some point the opportunities to actually have that conversation continues to open as more and more people start to question whether a private sector or a public only sector approach is going to work, where you need all three to make it happen.
Well, and your points maybe lead right into this next question, because one of the things we're observing here at Imagine Canada are increased closures of organizations. And it may be that there is an awakening of an understanding around the importance of this sector when communities don't have services. So just to segue in, Jordan, as it's been noted earlier, some of our key sector recommendations, a home and government, better data, core funding, they were absent from the budget. What do you see as the long-term implications of these key foundational recommendations remaining unaddressed?
Well, the tune that comes to my mind is an old song by Gladys Knight, "Lovin' or Next to Nothing," and that is what the sector is operating with. They can't go on loving on next to nothing. They are being asked to do an incredible amount. There are services being provided to the most vulnerable Canadians, and yet the core operating expenses are not being met. And so, as we potentially may enter a recession, as we are operating in an inflationary environment, costs are going up. Resources, the utility of existing resources, are being eaten away at by these rising costs. So something is going to have to give. And so charities and nonprofits are going to have to begin to make some very hard choices on the level of programs that they are offering right now to the communities that they're serving. And without access to reliable, sustainable funding, the sector as a whole is going to have to start to downscale the amount of services that it can offer. And that is going to leave the most vulnerable Canadians even more vulnerable in a time when they need supports the most. This is a disappointing thing, and this is something that I'm not entirely convinced government is understanding the impacts of fully.
So as we get to our last couple of questions, we're going to start to look a little bit down the road and in the future. So David, this budget was attempting to thread a pretty fine needle, demonstrate a measure of financial accountability while trying to invest in economic growth. And it'll be up to Canadians to decide if the government has succeeded. But as you look ahead, what are some of the upcoming issues that you see or think that will be relevant to charities and nonprofits in the coming months?
Two things domestically stand out to me, and there may be not so much in the coming months, but months, years, and maybe even a decade out, is demographic change that we're seeing in the country, and general economic deterioration and rising. Like inequality is already quite high. I think the environment we're seeing is it's going to potentially get worse before it has any chance of getting better. On the demographic front, I think two things are noteworthy. One is, Bruce, the question I'm often asked by employers in the country when I'm out, doing research or speaking is like, where did all the workers go, right? And this is a trend that we all knew was coming. Canada's an aging population. A generation is increasingly, those boomers are leaving the labor market in massive amounts of numbers and are putting great pressure on the healthcare system. Think of long-term care. Think of all of the things that as people age, they require. At the same time, issues around housing and those same services are being affected by what we've needed to do to replace those workers, which is, and I think a great thing, and it's going to help grow our economy, welcome millions of new people into the country, right? The government has, I think, reached a goal of 500,000. I think over the last year, our population grew by 1 million people, the first time ever it's done that. So we have this massive influx of new people into the country, and what's the impact of that, right? It's almost as if, and maybe I'm being too hard on the federal government here, is they I think they do have an economic strategy in mind, but they aren't looking at the full picture, right? They recognize we need skilled talent, and we need to replace our aging population. So they have opened up immigration into the country, but they haven't kept up with making sure the provinces and municipalities and other organizations that are active in our community have the resources to deliver the services that all those people are going to need, whether it's a home, whether it's a health care system or a family doctor, whether it's other kinds of services. So I think that to me is one of the big factors that we're talking about, but we're not really understanding. And that creates an opportunity for the sector to, again, connect the dots between where our country is going and the services that we are increasingly going to need, and the role that the sector can play globally. I mean, I think in the coming months, I unfortunately don't feel that the war, the invasion of Ukraine, is going to end anytime soon. The massive migration patterns that we're seeing are putting increased pressure, and then the general inequality as a result of the pandemic not really being over, and its effects not being felt, means the need for aid and support and international assistance isn't going away, even though our country's commitment to that doesn't seem to be increasing or ramping up. So I think those two factors to me demonstrate both a real challenging period ahead, but also one of lots of opportunities, right? And so for governments and policymakers that recognize the unique opportunity to partner with all sectors to help deliver this, and we're seeing it strangely more in the private sector around healthcare as an example, right? That once that third rail of Canadian politics where you can talk about private delivery of healthcare now for some reason has been deemed acceptable by many people, suggests that they're missing an obvious solution or an obvious choice, and that, as I've said multiple times today, is the nonprofit and charitable sector. So I come back to what we said at the beginning, is the opportunity to continue to connect the dots for policymakers and to show every day what impact organizations with a clear social purpose are having in their communities becomes so important in demonstrating to government that there's an effective partner out there that needs help, can't do it with the resources they have, but can be far more effective than any other solution.
Great thoughts as we think about what's coming ahead. So Jordan, last question to you. As we look ahead at the sector's ability to have a stronger presence in the annual federal budget, what do you think we need to do to be more successful on an annual basis?
I think fundamentally it comes down to securing an ability to have an ask internal to government. And it comes with making a home in government, whether that is how that looks is could be various different ways, whether that's a national council, whether that's a specific department, a specific minister name responsible. But the sector as a whole needs to have a place within the machinery of government to make a specific ask for the entirety of the sector. And this will allow issues that face the sector as a whole, issues around core funding, issues around better data collection, to have a very clear way to communicate those needs in one voice. Right now, each year the sector in its entirety needs to mobilize and make the case for and secure budget dollars. And with 170,000 nonprofits and charities across the country, it is a pretty daunting task to do this. So we need that space to be able to make those requests. And in making that space, I think it's important to say that doesn't mean that charities and nonprofits, once a home in government exists, are not are prevented from making budget asks for different areas, or continuing to work with the various portfolios right now we saw 160 million over 3 years from this budget provided to women's organizations through the status of women. But at the same time, we also saw 36 million over 3 years out of Health Canada for gender and reproductive health rights. So it is possible to have a home in government and still work across different portfolios. And I'll also say that it's important to engage other parties as well, not just the government of the day. To David's point, right when we began, this budget has a lot of concessions that were made based on asks of the NDP. And we see this around dental funding, we see this around the grocery rebate. And so it's interesting to consider that what this budget would have looked like if an opposition party was pretty adamant of charitable inclusion. And that might have been, if that was the ticket for their support on it. So it's important to keep this in mind as a sector as a whole, to not just think about the government's own rationalization for budget choices, but to also get cross-partisan support for critical investments in this sector.
Good stuff. And I certainly hear your point about a home in government doesn't mean we're home free. There'd still be lots of work to do on a regular basis. So Jordan, David, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us on this special Budget 2023 episode of Let's Imagine, and have a great day. Thanks for listening to the Let's Imagine podcast. For full show notes and to subscribe to our newsletter so you never miss an episode, please visit our website, www.imaginecanada.ca. Also, if you really like this episode, we invite you to leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to this podcast, as this helps other people discover us and engage in these conversations. And again, thanks to our sponsors, Carter's Professional Corporation and Sage Canada, for supporting our podcast.